Okay, let's dive right into this. Today, we're unpacking one of the most absolutely unbelievable and frankly controversial cases in modern American history. If you've ever found yourself totally fascinated by stories where reality just completely defies expectations, well, you're in the right place. We're looking at a terrifying true story that sounds so much like a Hollywood script, the authorities themselves literally refused to believe it was real. We're going to break down the facts step by step to understand exactly how a horrific crime was dismissed as a hoax and how the shocking truth finally came to light. Let's get into this explainer. I want you to just take a second and put yourself in this exact scenario. Imagine waking up in the dead of night to discover that the person you love most in the world has suddenly vanished. Your home's been invaded, you're terrified, so you do exactly what you've been taught to do your whole life, right? You call 911, you expect the police to show up to protect you and to save her. But instead, the very people you called for help turn around and accuse you of making the whole thing up. The media catches wind of it, they call you a liar. Almost overnight, millions of people genuinely believe you murdered your own partner. Now, this isn't some hypothetical thought experiment. This is exactly what happened. And to understand how things went so completely wrong, we need to go back to where it all started. Which brings us to part 1, a nightmare in Vallejo. We're heading back to March of 2015. Aaron Quinn and Denise Huskins were living a quiet, totally normal life in Vallejo, California. Up until this specific night, there was absolutely nothing unusual about their world. But look at this timeline, because the details here are what make this case so incredibly chilling. It's March 23rd, 2015. Around 3 a.m., Aaron suddenly wakes up. But it's not a noise that wakes him. It's these blinding bright lights flooding the bedroom. Before he can even process what on earth is happening, masked intruders are already inside his house. The sensory details from the reports are just terrifying. Heavy footsteps, this weird electronic buzzing, and the sound of zip ties tightening as the intruders bind him. And what's really terrifying, these guys were calm. They were organized, very professional. They didn't ask for money, they didn't want jewelry. Aaron was blindfolded, drugged, and left completely helpless as he listened to Denise being taken away into the dark. Hours later, he finally manages to free himself. He immediately calls the police, genuinely believing that the worst is over and help has finally arrived. But as we see in part 2, the police interrogation, that wasn't the case at all. You see, the nightmare of the home invasion was actually just the prologue. Aaron thought he had survived the absolute worst ordeal of his life. He thought the authorities would launch this massive search for Denise. He had no idea that instead of hunting for her kidnappers, the police were about to lock their sights entirely on him. 18. Just let that number sink in for a second. Aaron Quinn sat in an interrogation room under these harsh white lights for nearly 18 exhausting hours. For 18 hours, he was isolated, terrified for Denise, and forced to answer the exact same questions over and over and over again. The detectives had completely stopped searching for Denise. Instead, they were spending crucial, ticking hours trying to prove that Aaron was lying. Every single answer he gave was somehow twisted into another reason to doubt him. To the investigators sitting across from him, his story just sounded, well, too impossible. Then we hit a massive twist. Just 2 days later, Denise Huskins suddenly reappears. She's alive. She literally walks up to a house in the early morning, exhausted, terrified, and emotionally broken. She immediately sits down with the police and tells them exactly what happened. And here is the crucial detail. Her story matches Aaron's almost perfectly. She describes being kidnapped by intruders, held captive, blindfolded, and then unexpectedly released. Now, with both victims giving matching accounts, you'd think this is the moment the police realize their mistake and start hunting the real criminals, right? Nope, they didn't. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive divide between what actually happened and what the authorities chose to believe. On one side, you have the victim's reality. Masked intruders, night vision goggles, a highly organized and carefully planned kidnapping. On the other side, you have the authorities' theory. They decided it sounded entirely too much like a Hollywood movie. Because the methods were so bizarre and highly sophisticated, the investigators concluded it couldn't possibly be real. Instead of adjusting their worldview to fit the actual evidence, they decided the evidence must be a complete fabrication. Which leads us to part 3, the Gone Girl backlash. Because the police actively questioned their credibility, this case rapidly morphed from a local crime into a full-blown national media spectacle. The authorities set the tone and the public eagerly followed. The story exploded across America. News stations plastered breaking news banners across their screens, openly calling the entire event suspicious. Social media grabbed hold of the narrative, and within hours, millions of people decided they knew exactly what had happened. They branded Aaron and Denise as liars. The public instantly turned against two people who had just survived an unimaginable trauma, all because the official narrative gave them permission to do so. And the labels just kept coming. Attention seekers. Reporters and commentators went so far as to directly compare their horrific, real-life ordeal to the plot of the hit movie and book Gone Girl. They took a violent home invasion and kidnapping and turned it into pop culture entertainment. The media decided Aaron and Denise had simply invented the whole thing for fame and attention. They were publicly branded as frauds. Think about the devastating impact of that word. Aaron and Denise's lives were completely falling apart. They were dealing with the intense trauma of a kidnapping while simultaneously being mocked and vilified by the entire country. And honestly, the darkest part of this whole media frenzy? While the world was busy pointing fingers at the victims, the real criminal, a highly organized, very dangerous individual, was still walking free, completely unbothered by the police. Let's move to part 4, the second attack, and see how this builds. Because the truth has a funny way of demanding to be seen. The turning point in this story doesn't actually happen in Vallejo. It happens hundreds of miles away, and it completely shatters the neat little narrative the authorities and the media had constructed. Hundreds of miles away, another woman reports an attempted kidnapping to the police, and when she describes her attacker, the details are terrifyingly familiar. It's the exact same method, the exact same behavior, the exact same careful, bizarre planning. Suddenly, the impossible sounded entirely real. For the very first time, investigators were forced to stop and ask themselves a genuinely frightening question. What if Aaron and Denise had been telling the truth all along? And that brings us to part 5, uncovering the real criminal. This realization completely shifts the momentum of the case. The police finally stop looking at the victims and start looking for the actual perpetrator. And when another, separate investigation finally connects the dots, they are led to a man that absolutely no one saw coming. The suspect's name was Matthew Muller. Now, it's easy to see why he flew under the radar. He was a former Marine. He was a Harvard-educated lawyer. On paper, he appeared highly intelligent, successful, and completely ordinary. But behind that perfectly normal appearance, investigators discovered that Muller had been carefully, methodically planning violent crimes for years. He possessed the exact combination of tactical knowledge and legal understanding to execute complex crimes and avoid detection. So the crucial point is how quickly the whole hoax theory collapsed once they searched Muller's property. Investigators recovered evidence that perfectly matched Aaron and Denise's story. They found the zip ties used to bind Aaron. They found the black goggles used to blindfold them. They even found a laptop that perfectly corroborated the victims' accounts of the electronic aspects of the crime. All those details that detectives had literally laughed off as being from a Hollywood movie were suddenly sitting right in front of them in evidence boxes. The kidnapping was real. Aaron and Denise had never lied. Which brings us to our final section, part 6, believing the victims. The vindication of Aaron and Denise brought this massive wave of shock, but honestly, the biggest shock wasn't the identity of the kidnapper. The real shock, and really the lasting legacy of this case, is the massive failure of the investigation itself and the mirror it held up to the authorities and the media. News channels suddenly had to issue these awkward corrections. The same authorities who publicly humiliated the victims were now facing intense public criticism. People started asking incredibly difficult institutional questions, like, what if the police had simply believed Aaron from the very beginning? If they had spent those first 18 hours hunting the kidnapper instead of interrogating the victim, could other crimes have been prevented? Could more victims have been protected from a dangerous man who was left free to strike again? The source material summarizes the entire ordeal with this incredibly powerful thought, and it hits the nail right on the head. Sometimes, the greatest mistake isn't failing to catch the criminal. It's failing to believe the victim. This case is a stark, unavoidable reminder that institutional disbelief carries a massive cost. When the people whose job it is to protect us decide that our truth is just too inconvenient or too strange to be real, it leaves the door wide open for true monsters to operate in the shadows. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought. This investigation became one of the most controversial in modern America because it proved that reality is, very often, far stranger than fiction. Aaron and Denise were telling the truth the entire time, even when the whole world was laughing at them. So the next time you hear a story that sounds just a little too bizarre, maybe a little too impossible to be real, ask yourself, Are you actually listening to the facts, or are you just assuming you already know the ending? When the truth sounds impossible, who will you choose to believe? Thanks for joining me as we uncover the facts of this incredible case. I hope this analysis helped clarify exactly how this bizarre story unfolded. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.